Good morning. The committee will come to order, and without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recess at any time. Pursuant to Committee Rule 2E and House Rule 11, the chair announces that she may postpone roll call votes. Pursuant to notice, the committee meets to consider the following measure. H.R. 5260, promoting research and observations of space weather to improve forecasting to Tomorrow Act. Let me say good morning again and Happy New Year. I'd like to welcome everyone for our first markup of the year. And today we are marking up the bipartisan PROSWIFT Act. I'd like to thank Representatives Perlmutter and Mr. Brooks for introducing H.R. 5260. And space weather is a priority for this committee, so I'm pleased that we are taking a strong step forward in supporting research, observations, and actions to improve space weather forecasting and prediction. It is clear that we have benefited greatly with the efficiency of this area. As this committee has extensively explored in recent years, space weather is a result of complex interactions between the sun, the solar wind, Earth's magnetic field, and Earth's atmosphere. Space weather phenomena, such as solar flares, can send potentially harmful particles and radiation toward the Earth and our orbiting satellites. Such phenomena can damage critical infrastructure such as satellite navigation systems, communications, and our electric grid, upon which we are increasingly dependent. Space weather phenomena can also impact our astronauts living and working in space. Fundamental scientific questions about the sun, the solar environment, and the sun-Earth interactions remain unanswered. This limits our current ability to forecast space weather phenomena. The way we can forecast terrestrial weather, when our Environment and Space and Aeronautics subcommittees held a joint hearing on space weather this past October, we heard that many gaps remain in the observational and modeling capabilities that support space weather research and operations. The legislation before us today directs federal agencies to continue supporting critical observing capabilities on the ground and in space, and looks forward assessing and addressing those gaps. The bill codifies clear roles and responsibilities of federal agencies in understanding, predicting, and forecasting space weather. It enhances collaboration not only within the government, but with and among non-governmental partners in academia, industry, and the space weather end user and international communities. Addressing our nation's space weather needs and capabilities has been a bipartisan, bicameral congressional priority for many years. I want to particularly thank Mr. Perlmutter, who has introduced versions of this legislation in previous Congresses, and his staff for their persistence and dedication to the important issue. It may have been a long road to get there, but I do think that the legislation before us today is stronger because of the efforts that Mr. Perlmutter and our colleagues across the aisle and the broader space weather community have put into it. I look forward to considering this bipartisan bill today and quickly moving it to the floor for consideration by the House. I now recognize our ranking member, Mr. Lucas, for opening remarks.
Thank you, Chairwoman Johnson. This morning, the committee will mark up H.R. 5260, the Promoting Research and Observations of Space Weather to Improve the Forecasting of Tomorrow Act. This committee has held multiple hearings on this important topic. This Congress, the Space and Environment Subcommittees held a joint hearing on this topic in October. Members of the subcommittees heard from experts about the potentially severe effects of space weather incidents and how we can best prepare for and mitigate the consequences of these incidents. The impacts of space weather incidents will only increase as we see development of low Earth economy and more space-based assets providing services and information to us all. One key takeaway from this hearing is that a strategy addressing space weather risks must involve government, academic, and commercial participation. I particularly want to emphasize the need to ensure the participation of the commercial sector, which will be the subject of an amendment I will offer this morning. If my amendment's adopted, I believe this legislation becomes a comprehensive bill that addresses the needs of all those who are participating in developing the United States space weather strategy. And with the adoption of my amendment, I will offer my support to passage of this bill. I want to thank Congressman Perlmutter and his staff for their willingness to negotiate up to the last minute so that we could reach a deal to put forth what I believe is the best possible version of this legislation on this important topic. And with that, I thank you, Chairwoman Johnson, and I yield back.
Thank you. We will now consider H.R. 5260, the PROSWIFT Act. The clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 5260, a bill to improve.
Without objection, the bill is considered as read and open to amendment at any point. I now recognize Mr. Perlmutter to speak on this bill.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I move to strike the last word. I'm pleased we're here today to mark up H.R. 5260, the PROSWIFT Act. Space weather is electromagnetic activity, solar eruptions, solar flares, and radiation, which come from the sun and can have significant societal, economic, national security, and health implications both here on Earth and in space. Over 4 years ago, Dr. Dan Baker from the University of Colorado testified in front of this committee about the dangers of space weather events on the electric grid, our communication systems, and our satellites. At that hearing, he said, had an observed July 2012 space weather event actually hit the Earth, we would, and I'm quoting him, still be picking up the pieces. That testimony stuck with me. And when Senators Gary Peters and Cory Gardner introduced the Space Weather Research and Forecasting Act a few months later, I was eager to start working on the House companion bill. Since 2016, the Senate has passed a version of this legislation a couple times, and the Science Committee took up one of those bills in 2018. But we've never been able to come to an agreement on language that can pass both the House and the Senate. Thankfully, I think today we are going to take the first step towards ending that streak and finally pass this bill into law. In 2015, the Office of Science and Technology Policy pulled together the best and brightest from within the various agencies, academia, and the private sector working on space weather to produce the National Space Weather Strategy and Action Plan. These documents help renew our focus on the critical research and operational needs to improve our space weather enterprise, and OSTP updated the strategy and action plan again last year. H.R. 5260 helps build upon this work by providing the structure needed for the continued advancement of heliophysics research, collection of new data and observations, and improvements to our modeling and forecasting. Our bill also, for the first time, clearly delineates the roles and responsibilities of the key federal agencies involved in space weather, including NOAA, NASA, the National Science Foundation, the Department of Defense, the FAA, the Interior Department, and OSTP. Additionally, our legislation brings in new voices from the academic community, commercial space weather sector, and space weather forecast end users. These communities will participate in the Space Weather Advisory Group created in the bill, as well as on new government academia commercial roundtable, which is created and then facilitated by the National Academies of Science. Finally, the bill also sets up a formal research to operations and operations to research mechanisms to help break down barriers between the research community and forecasters by encouraging sharing of information and requirements to improve the pipeline of new observations and technologies. This bill will significantly improve our understanding of space weather and better prepare us for its impacts on the electric grid, the communication networks, satellite operations, airline operations, and as we continue to add more things to the internet, to transportation systems and our connected economy. It will also help NASA understand the radiation environment, as the chairwoman said, for our astronauts on the International Space Station, on their way back to the moon, and most importantly, and I don't have my bumper sticker, on their journey to Mars by 2033. We've been working on this bill for some time now, and I want to thank Mo Brooks for his help pushing for this bipartisan legislation, as well as Chairwoman Johnson and her staff and Ranking Member Lucas and his staff for their support over the years of getting us to where we are today. I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record the following letters of support we've received on the bill from the University of Colorado, the University Corporation for Atmospheric Research, the American Commercial Space Weather Association, the American Astronomical Society, the American Geophysical Union, the University of Michigan, the University of New Hampshire, and Pennsylvania State University. And with that, I encourage all my colleagues to support the bill, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. Where's your bumper sticker?
I don't know. Where is my bumpers? It's, one of them is on my car.
Okay.
I know.
Okay, now the chair recognizes Mr. Brooks for his remarks.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for bringing this bill up for markup today. The Promoting Research and Observations of Space Weather to Improve the Forecasting of Tomorrow Act, called the PROSWIFT Act, will advance America's understanding of the potential consequences of severe space weather events that have proven in the past to be far-reaching and potentially damaging. By way of background, and as has been already outlined today, space weather is a collection of physical processes beginning at the sun with solar winds and ultimately affecting human activities on Earth and in space. These solar winds and their interaction with Earth's atmosphere are not understood as well as they should be. This bill is a step towards a better understanding. At Alabama's Marshall Space Flight Center, scientists and engineers have been at the forefront of this vital research. Under the PROSWIFT Act, their research will be enhanced to advance our nation's understanding and ability to forecast space weather. Because Mr. Perlmutter and I are both passionate advocates for deep space exploration, I emphasize the relationship between space weather observation and forecasting and deep space exploration. The PROSWIFT Act makes it clear that not only can space weather impact us on the terrestrial frontier, but it can and will impact us in the final frontier of deep space exploration. In order to achieve the goals set for NASA's Artemis program, and before we launch a manned mission to Mars, we must better understand how space weather phenomena impacts life in space, satellites, and other space instrumentation. It is critical that we have the ability to properly forecast space weather and prepare for and protect astronauts from the dangers of solar radiation. I want to thank my colleague, Mr. Perlmutter, for his leadership on space weather and his partnership on the PROSWIFT Act. I encourage my colleagues to vote for this bill.
Thank you very much. Are there any others who wish to be recognized? Ms. Horn?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'd like to thank, Representative Perlmutter and Brooks and Ranking Member Lucas for the work on this. Today's markup of H.R. 5260, the PROSWIFT Act, represents an important step for this committee in addressing a critical issue for our nation, space weather. As the chairwoman noted in her opening statement, space weather phenomena such as solar flares, solar wind, and geomagnetic storms of energized charged particles can disrupt our ground and space-based technologies as well as our infrastructure. While economic impacts of space weather are difficult to know precisely, a 2017 study estimated the cost to U.S. electricity consumers alone in the $400 million to $10 billion range for a moderate space weather event, and $1 billion to $20 billion for a more extreme event. And that's just one economic sector. That's why it is imperative that we coordinate our federal agencies' work on space weather, collaborate with academia, industry, and international partners, and invest in basic research and operational capabilities that can improve our capability to model and predict space weather phenomenon. H.R. 5260 does just that. It identifies roles and responsibilities for federal agencies involved in space weather-related activities and establishes an interagency working group led by the Office of Science and Technology Policy to coordinate those efforts. It also establishes an advisory group to benefit from the advice of academic, commercial space weather sectors, and space weather end users. The bill directs the undertaking of a comprehensive survey of the needs of space weather users and establishes a policy to sustain a baseline capability for space weather observations, as well as directing the development of an integrated strategy for observations and measurements that are essential for space weather research models, forecasting, and prediction. In addition, this bill establishes important pathways to build, sustain, and enhance the transition of research to operations and operations to help inform research. One such pathway includes a forum for ongoing knowledge transfer and information exchange through the arrangement of a space weather government, academic, commercial roundtable. Among the many federal agencies involved in space weather activities, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, has an important role in collecting space-based observations and measurements and conducting basic research on the sun and the Earth-Sun environment. As the chairwoman of the Space and Aeronautics Subcommittee, I look forward to continuing to monitor NASA's basic research on solar and space physics and the transition of that research into operational capabilities that can enable improved space weather forecasting and the prediction that underlies the policy, as well as ensuring the protection of our astronauts. Madam Chair, I believe this bill, H.R. 5260, represents an important, addressing critical issues both for research but also for our economic security and ability to operate on the terrestrial environment, and an important example of how we can come to compromise and consensus reaching across the aisle that this committee has done well on a number of issues, and I urge my colleagues to support it, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. Any other requests for time? Mr. Foster,
Strike the last word.
recognize.
When, as I hope about to pass this important piece of legislation, I think because this is a time when the rationale for international collaboration in science is really under stress from a number of directions, I think we should acknowledge that what we're doing is following in the footsteps of Hannes Alfvén, who won the Nobel Prize, a Swedish electrical engineer and plasma physicist who won the Nobel Prize in 1970 for his contributions. Besides Alfvén waves, his discovery and description of Alfvén waves, which drove me nuts in graduate school doing those calculations, he also made contributions to the behavior of the aurora, the Van Allen radiation belts, the effect of magnetic storms on the Earth's magnetic field, the terrestrial magnetosphere, and the dynamics of plasmas in the Milky Way. And so I think it's really important that we understand that the world would be a poorer place without international collaboration. And our country will end up being a less safe place if we reject that sort of collaboration. And so I want to join everyone else in helping Hannes Alfvén answer the musical question, what's it all about, Alfvén? Yield back.
Thank you very much. Any other requests for time? Seeing none, then Mr. Perlmutter is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 1, amendment to H.R. 5260, offered by Mr. Perlmutter of Colorado.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense of the reading, and without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you. And I move to strike the last word. Madam Chair, this manager's amendment is really just a lot of technical amendments and repagination. So it makes improvements to the bill based on feedback we received since introducing the bill in November. And I should tell the committee that we have worked a lot with the administration, particularly NOAA, in connection with this bill. We also adjust several of the timelines included in the bill to allow the agencies, the advisory group, and the National Academies of Science enough time to complete their work. And with that, I encourage all my colleagues to support the manager's amendment, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. Any further comments? Hearing none, then the vote occurs on the amendment. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. The next amendment is Mr. Lucas's amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment number 2, amendment to H.R. 5260, offered by Mr. Lucas.
Ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Chairwoman Johnson. My amendment would add a section of the legislation establishing a commercial space data pilot program at NOAA. This amendment is drawn from a comprehensive language agreed to at the end of the 115th Congress by members of this committee. Let me again be clear that if this amendment is adopted, I'm prepared to support the underlying legislation. During the committee's October hearing, we heard from former NOAA Administrator Admiral Conrad Lautenbacher about the role of the commercial sector in forecasting and preparing for space weather events. He noted the commercial space industry has seen tremendous growth in the last decade and has a vested interest in investing in the collection of space weather data in order to help protect commercial space infrastructure in low Earth orbit. Further, he made clear there are companies who are prepared to set up their activities if they have a clearly defined role in obtaining space weather data. My amendment balances the need to help ensure there's a market for commercial space weather data with the existing roles of the federal government and the academic community. And let me emphasize to my colleagues, this program is merely a pilot and expires after 4 years, so we would not permanently authorize a program with this amendment. I want to again thank Mr. Perlmutter and his staff for their good faith efforts to reach this compromise. This is the third version of space weather legislation that's been considered since the 114th Congress. And because of their willingness to work with us and accommodate our concerns, this is the first House-introduced piece of space weather legislation to pass out of the Science Committee. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment and, upon its adoption, support the final bill. And with that, I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lucas. And I appreciate your willingness to work with us to find the compromise language that the majority could support. I support the amendment, and I yield back. Is there further discussion on the amendment? Mr. Perlmutter.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I move to strike the last word. I rise to support my occasional friend, Mr. Lucas's amendment. No, he is my friend, and actually, you know, part of legislating is to develop friendships around this place so that when you do run into loggerheads or disagreements, you can sit down and say, okay, is there a better way to approach this? And we were able to do that, and I do thank him for his friendship. I understand the ranking member's passion for involvement of the commercial space sector in our weather forecasting. And with this amendment in our space weather forecasting, I share much of his passion for ensuring the commercial sector participates in these activities because they will have good ideas, good technologies, and good products from which we all can benefit. That is actually one of the key reasons I've been working on this bill for the last 4 years. I wanted to better include the commercial sector and academia in the assessments and planning being conducted by the federal government regarding space weather. That is why the PROSWIFT Act creates the first ever space weather advisory group, so commercial space weather companies, the academic community, and space weather end users like the airlines can all advise on the development of the integrated strategy. The PROSWIFT Act also creates a new government academic industry roundtable to facilitate ongoing dialogue between these important stakeholders throughout the year and not just on the development of integrated strategy. I'm glad to support this amendment, and I look forward to its passage, and I look forward to passage of the PROSWIFT Act. With that, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Is there further discussion on the amendment? Hearing none, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, nay. The amendment is agreed to. Are there any other amendments? Seeing none, then a reporting quorum being present, I move that the Committee on Science, Space, and Technology report H.R. 5260 as amended to the House with the recommendation that the bill be approved. Those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the bill is favorably reported. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. I ask unanimous consent that staff be authorized to make any necessary technical and conforming changes to the bill. Without objection, so ordered. Members will have 2 subsequent calendar days in which to submit supplemental, minority, or additional views on the measure. I want to thank the members for their cooperation. This markup is concluded, and we adjourn. That's pretty good.